All right, rejoining the channel is our good friend, Aviation Week writer, Steve Trimble. Steve, how are you doing?
Great, thanks.
So your most recent item at Aviation Week is titled, Russia Gaining in Drone War, Forcing Ukraine to Adapt. You're fresh from actually going there and seeing this firsthand. So talk to us about what this article reveals.
So I went to Ukraine last month for about 5 days. I attended the Defense Tech Valley Summit in Lviv. This is basically a drone expo, drone technology expo for the military drones. They had the military operators there, the manufacturers, the Ukrainian and Western manufacturers of the drones, as well as other government officials. And it was a really interesting insight into what their concerns were. I thought they were very candid about their vulnerabilities and the things that they're most worried about on the Ukrainian side of the conflict. And that's because they perceive that Russia has gained an advantage in the drone conflict and the drone aspect of the conflict, mainly by taking the innovations that Ukraine pioneered in the last 1 to 2 years and using it against the Ukrainians, but at a larger scale and with expanded range. We've been talking all through the conflict about the rapid evolution of the capabilities of these relatively small drones. And I don't know if your viewers remember or were looking at this at the very beginning of the conflict, it started out as a pretty desperate thing where Ukrainians were taking whatever they had, drones, toy drones, anything off the shelf, coming up with homemade weapons or munitions, homemade incendiaries to put on these drones, and basically turning them into drone-delivered Molotov cocktails. That was really how it began. And then it got more and more sophisticated. They started buying drones, bringing, whether they were commercial or military, and then putting conventional munitions on those drones and using those against the Russians. But these were still very primitive in a way. They were controlled by radio frequency links, which were easy to jam at low altitudes. So that drove innovations towards high altitude drones that could fly above the jamming, and fiber optic controlled drones that could fly at low altitudes, but they would carry this coil of fiber optic cable that would sort of spool out as they're moving forward. And the cable would be attached to a human controller, which would make these drones far more jam resistant because there was no radio frequency link. There was an actual tethered link to the human controller. The range of these types of drones was pretty short, 5 kilometers, 8 kilometers. It's now moved to over the summer. We saw Ukrainians experimenting and testing a drone with a 50-kilometer spool of fiber optic cable. There's been pictures and other evidence showing that the Russians have deployed these FPV or first-person vehicle drones carrying spools of 40 kilometers worth of fiber optic cable. And that's become the new weapon. But it's not just the technology, it's how the Russians are using it. That's the big concern.
So how are they using it that's different? And what are the Ukrainians doing to adapt?
Back in the first or second week of August, we saw the first real example of how Russia has been able to gain this advantage, albeit short term and not in any revolutionary sense. It's an incremental advantage. But it was with the offensive at Dobrapilya, which is right by Pokrovsk. And in that section of the front during that week, and it was right before the Alaska summit, the Russians were able to achieve one of the deepest breakthroughs they've been able to make in the Ukrainian defenses on the front lines, pushing their soldiers up to 15 kilometers deep behind the lines and even severing the highway between Dobrapilya and Kramatorsk. Looking back on that operation, there was a lot of things going on, but one of the things that made that operation so successful was the use of medium range or mid-range first-person vehicle drones by the Russians that had these fiber optic cables. And they were able to operate those deep behind the Ukrainian lines to target the vehicles that were resupplying and rotating troops from the back of the lines to the front, and which made it very difficult for the Ukrainians to reinforce their positions and to resupply those positions. These Russian innovations really came from this new organization that the Russians stood up about a year ago called Rubicon. It's the Rubicon Center for, I think, Unmanned System Technology, I believe, in Moscow. And they were very active in scaling up these FPV drones to the point where now they're making 50,000 a month. And used in this way, it creates a lot of problems for the Ukrainians, because what has been the sort of state of the drone war up until the last few months is that the Ukrainians and Russians are on either side of the front, and about 20 kilometers deep on the Russian side, the Ukrainians established with this sort of drone reconnaissance strike complex a kill zone about 20 kilometers deep, that anything that moved in that kill zone, they would have the Ukrainians would have fixed wing drones up at high altitude, being able to peer inside that space, and then vector strike drones or interceptor drones into that space, so that the Russians were not able to use their manpower advantage. Right, the Russians have a 6-to-1 manpower advantage in most areas of the front, but they're not able to use it. They haven't been able to use it effectively, because if they mass forces inside this 20-kilometer kill box, they would be immediately destroyed. But because they were able to scale up their FPVs, their version of FPVs, and these come in different categories. There's interceptor FPVs, there's strike FPVs. Those interceptor FPV drones have been targeting those fixed-wing reconnaissance UAVs, denying Ukraine the ability to see into that kill box. And that's created opportunities for maneuver on the Russian side into that area in ways that they just couldn't do before. These incremental changes have led to certain breakouts on both sides as each side gets an advantage. Neither side, though, has been able to fully exploit that advantage. As we saw with Russia in that breakout at Dobropilya, a lot of that has already been rolled back. The first Azov Corps were essentially moved into the area by the Ukrainians. They've rolled up a lot of the positions that the Russians were able to take during that brief breakout. There's a lot of reasons for that, one of which is the number of mines on either side of the front is extensive. Thousands and thousands of mines, sometimes per square kilometer. Any invading force that doesn't know exactly where those mines are and how to navigate through them is going to just essentially run into a wall that'll slow them down, while the other side is able to muster reinforcements and stop the breach. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. The big change has been the depth of which Russia can strike with their FPV drones. Now we've seen Ukraine start in the last week, even since I've been back, start to test and experiment with ways to deny those. There was a really interesting report in the Ukrainian press, I think just a couple days ago, of a barbed wire, a string of barbed wire that the Ukrainians are laying down one of these roads that they use for resupplying the front. And the barbed wire is on this spinning coil or spinning, it spins because the fiber optic cables, they don't stay in the air. They trail along the ground. So this string of barbed wire is only 6 or 8 inches off the ground, and it can sever that cable, and if it comes across it, and they could lay it across the roads that they use for resupply convoys, and make it much harder for the Russians to use that technology. I mean, that's just one example. Maybe the Russians will figure out a way to avoid that. They've also tried things like putting up cages and having cages, metal wire cages going down these resupply routes. The Russians have already figured out ways around that, blowing a hole in the cage and then having the second drone come through that hole. What was proposed by the president of the Institute for the Study of War, Kimberly Kagan, she was at this event too, and her suggestion was that it's time for Ukraine to flip the script again against the Russians, and basically take that mid-range capability that the Russians have pioneered and now use it against them. And her point is that the Russians are even more susceptible to that because they depend on their manpower advantage for the most part. Right now, that 20-kilometer kill box behind the front, the Russians keep their forces beyond those 20 kilometers. So if you can target those troop concentrations and their headquarters and their supply depots that are in that 20 to 80 kilometer box behind the front line, that would force the Russians to move those troop concentrations and all those other things even further back, making it even harder for them to maneuver and exploit any kind of breach that their frontline units are able to make. So, and I think we're going to see this go on both sides. But one thing that I think really concerns the Ukrainians is this Russian scale advantage on top of their manpower advantage. Ukraine just cannot match how many FPV drones that the Russian industry can make. And I don't think anybody in the West can help them with that. I mean, they can help, but actually matching the volume of FPV drone production in Russia would be very difficult.
So over the years, we've focused on what specific equipment we supplied, NATO supplied to Ukraine, Patriots, ATACMS, F-16s. I did half a dozen episodes with Justin and others about the F-16s they were getting and what that would yield. What I'm hearing from your experiences over there in Lviv is particularly in, let's just call it the Eastern Front, those other weapon systems are kind of moot, right? Because what you're trying to affect is the ability to change the ground scheme of maneuver with air superiority that is drone-centric. How does this play out? Is this going to change the outcome of the war, or is it just another impasse with this move, counter move kind of thing?
This is a frozen conflict. It's been pretty clear ever since Ukraine was able to retake large parts of Kharkiv and Kherson a couple of years ago, that we haven't seen anything like that on either side since. Now, Russia has made a lot of incremental small gains on their side. Ukraine's made some incremental small gains. They obviously also made that big incursion into Kursk, a lot of which has already been rolled back. That was about a year ago. But otherwise, yeah, it's still pretty frozen. Now, all those weapon systems that you've been talking about, the ATACMS and the HIMARS systems, those did help in moving Russian artillery back further behind the front lines. So they could not stay within that 20-kilometer kill box. The F-16s and now the Mirages that the Ukrainians have received have been added to their air defense system, which also includes their Su-27s and MiG-29s that are still flying. Those are mainly operating behind the front lines, well behind the front lines, attacking Shaheeds and cruise missiles that are getting past that the sort of tripwire near the front line. Now, in some cases, they are supporting their infantry and lobbing glide munitions and also launching cruise missiles. But for the most part, they are not engaged in that frontline war. And this is not a war, a NATO-style war of maneuver, right? It's a World War I frozen conflict. The big factor is, as long as, this has been going on now for almost 4 years. There is a certain palpable sense of exhaustion that I could see on the Ukrainian side. Determination, absolutely, but still an exhaustion and a wariness about how much longer they can keep this up. I know that there are also those concerns on the Russian side. how long their economy can withstand this level of mobilization of their economy to support the war effort. And not only that, their human population, given the amount of losses, human losses that they've taken. But barring a collapse on one side or the other, you're just going to keep finding ways for both sides to try to steal an incremental advantage somewhere else that they might be able to use, in hoping that with the larger pressure that they're putting on the other side as well, economically, physically, and all other means that they're using, that it creates some kind of collapse at some point.
Yeah, and obviously the dynamic that you just definitely described makes the idea of peace problematic, because nobody's really incentivized absent the exhaustion factor. So as you attend trade shows and air shows around the world, Dubai and Paris and Farnborough, and this most recent thing that you just did in Ukraine, what are you seeing in terms of the industry reaction to the drone innovations that are going on both sides of the Ukrainian conflict?
I think it does help to look at Ukraine and Russia somewhat in isolation, because neither side intended for this drone conflict. This was not part of anybody's strategy. It sort of grew out of the situation they found themselves in. And that situation largely occurred because neither side was able to create air superiority at the initial phase of the conflict. Ukraine just didn't have the capacity, and Russia simply didn't prioritize it. They had not established air superiority at the time they started their ground offensive. They were trying to do it in parallel with the ground offensive, and that didn't work. I don't think NATO or a NATO country would attempt to do something like this without first establishing air superiority. And if they weren't able to establish air superiority, I'm not sure that they would have started the ground offensive, when they did, right? And that creates a very different, overall situation on the battlefield. There is still the question, is air superiority even possible in the modern context? Given the air defenses that are available and have proliferated at so many different levels. We did get a glimpse of what that may look like in a way with Iran and the Israeli airstrikes, and their ability to sort of systematically dismantle the Iranian air defense system. I'm not saying that the Iranian air defense system is the modern state-of-the-art standard, but they had some very powerful systems available to them that Israel, through special operations teams on the ground and stealth fighters in the air, were able to dismantle to the point that Israel was able to operate freely in Iranian airspace for extended periods of time. As Western, governments, militaries are looking at this, what I've seen, at least on the U.S. side, because that's the one I probably pay most attention to, is a bifurcation of sorts. There is investment in the drones and one-way attack munitions and cruise missiles at a scale we've never seen before. Still not the scale that Russia is doing, or even that Ukraine is doing domestically. But at the same time, a parallel track with, B-21s, F-47s, still F-35s, F-15s, and more advanced munitions. So, that's probably where things are going to keep going, unless something, really changes.
You bring up a great point with the sort of recent historical context. The other data point I would add is the Pakistan-India air war. And so that's about stick length. That's about active PL-15 capability, 140-mile shots. That's a subset, just like drones are a subset of an overall strategy. As you rightly point out, they iterated into this drone campaign. It wasn't their starting strategy because, as you say, Russia was inept with their existing air force. They mismanaged it, and Ukraine just didn't have the resources. So they had to start building quadcopters in their garages using their domestic brain power, the same brain power that they had. And this is why Putin wants the engineering part of the population as his own, is because they are resilient and they're pretty damn good at it, you know. But you make a good point in terms of that wasn't the starting strategy. So those subject matter experts are saying, hey, everything's drones now. And I've seen some of this in the political sphere where they talk about we should cancel the Ford class and the F-35 because everything else is going to be unmanned, right? That's what Elon said during the campaign.
I mean, I definitely think that there's going to be a need for USVs, UUVs, at least in addition to the Ford class. F-35 is working with CCAs, and so there is an unmanned element that's coming, but there is also severe limitations on what those unmanned or autonomous systems can do on their own without being like in Ukraine. There's not a lot of swarming going on. There's not a lot of AI enabled swarming. You just don't see that. With the one exception being Operation Spiderweb, where they were able to infiltrate a large number of small quadcopters enabled by AI target matching technology. So once their GPS signals were jammed, they were still able to find and identify their targets on their own. So that, in that case, swarming did work. But at the same time, it's not being used at scale at this point in Russia and Ukraine. They're still physically controlling each of these drones that are being flown on both sides of the front lines. And same thing, CCAs will be semi-autonomous, so they'll be able to do. And CCAs are collaborative combat aircraft, so think of MQ-28 or XQ-67 isn't really. Actually, I should say YFQ-42 and YFQ-44 on the U.S. Air Force side. Marines are experimenting with Kratos and the XQ-58. Navy is starting to get into this as well, but these are going to be tethered in some way to a human controller, either in a fighter cockpit or an AWACS aircraft, because there's just limitations on what they know how to do and how they respond to real world situations with infinite, variables. And all that's being worked through, and they'll get better and better and better as the software gets trained and there's more experience. But it's going to take a while to get there.
Well, as always, great perspective from Aviation Week's Steve Trimble. Steve, thanks for joining us once again, and I hope to see you in town before too long.
That'd be great.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.